Okay, hello, welcome to our discussion on the Gospel of Mark. Pull up our PowerPoint here. And when we get started on the Gospel of Mark, although it's the second of the Gospels that we get in what's known as canonical order, meaning the order when you open the Bible, what are you going to get first? When we open the New Testament, of course, we get Matthew first. But actually, most Bible scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was written first. It is the shortest of the Gospels. And but I guess I should back up and describe real quick. When I use the word gospel, you've read about it a couple of times, but there's two different ways to describe this. There's the gospel, which is kind of what people may share with you about the good news of Jesus, the message of Jesus dying for the sins of the world, and the fact that we can believe in our hearts that we can confess with our lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead and we'll be saved. Some people want to share that with us and known as the gospel or the good news. But also there's a type of writing, a gospel, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And these are short, somewhat like an ancient biography, but unlike a biography today where, let's say we're doing the life of LeBron James, we would start at the beginning of his life all the way through high school, into when he played for the Cavs and then the Heat and the Cavs again, and all this kind of stuff. But in the ancient world, these short biographies were actually really specific. The author would only include details the author wanted. So there could be huge gaps in people's lives in these stories, and it was really up to the author. So when we think about the telling of Jesus's life, when it comes to these gospels, we know that there are huge gaps. So think about the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, there is no telling of Jesus's birth. The first time we get any indication of Jesus's life is in the first chapter of Mark, verse 15. Jesus appeared as a full-grown adult man, and he's beginning to launch into his ministry, and he tells us to repent and believe. The kingdom of God is near. There's no birth, there's no teenage years, there's nothing. We just get right to it. And actually, Mark tells us a very niche part of Jesus's life, about 3 years. So with these gospels, they have a bend or a bias. The authors are wanting us to see a particular picture of Jesus. But the great thing about these gospels is they show us what the earliest Christians believed about Jesus. We call this the kerygma, or the teachings, the central truths of early Christianity. So when we think about the Gospel of Mark, we have to ask the question, who's the author? And the author is historically claimed to be a young man by the name of John Mark. Now, he is one who would travel with St. Paul, the apostle that we'll meet later. But John Mark really is the interpreter of Peter. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, who in the world is Peter? Well, Peter is one of the 12 disciples who walked and talked with Jesus. And he was chosen as a fisherman to follow and be Jesus's disciple. And as we track the story of Jesus, we'll find out that Peter was one of the intimate three, meaning that there were three disciples that were with Jesus in every important moment: James, Peter, and John, Peter being the closest of all. And actually in the previous gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, Peter makes this declaration about Jesus and says, hey, you are the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. Jesus tells Peter, you didn't get this on your own. God's Spirit told you this. And then Jesus turns to Peter and says, you know what? On this rock, I'm going to build my church. Now, Jesus was making a play on Peter's name, because Peter's name really meant kind of a pebble or a stone, and Jesus calls him a rock. But in that, Jesus is telling Peter, you're going to be the leader of the church. If you've ever heard of the Pope, well, Peter went to Rome before he was killed for the faith, and he becomes the leader of the church in Rome, the Bishop of Rome. Well, today, the modern expression of the Pope, the role of the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. So really, the Catholic Church sees Peter as the beginning of it. Now, Peter is the one who will lead the movement of early Christianity after Jesus's life. We see this as early as the second chapter of a book known of Acts. Acts is the text that helps us go from the life of Jesus to the life of early Christians. And in the second chapter of Acts, God's Spirit is given to the church, and Peter is the first person to rise up and to speak and explain what's going on. He is the figurehead. So the Gospel of Mark, if I haven't lost you yet, the Gospel of Mark is actually Peter's insight on Jesus. So this is the earliest of Gospels, and it was written for the believers in Rome. And how we know this is it was written for a non-Jewish audience, and it's written, the context, why it's being written, is not only to share the life of Jesus, but also to share the life of Jesus in the midst of suffering and persecution. These earliest Christians in Rome were really suffering. So the writer here is going to share the story to seek to encourage those Christians who are really suffering. So what we're going to see a specific image of Jesus. And in here, we're going to see Jesus as a Jewish rabbi. The word rabbi is another name for teacher. So we're going to see Jesus imaged as a Jewish teacher. Also, we're going to see Jesus as what's called an eschatological prophet, meaning one who is talking about the end of the age. Now, I don't mean the end of the world, because Jesus didn't believe in the end of the world. And actually, early Christians didn't believe in the end of the world. But what they did see was this period that we're in now, this period of pain and suffering and difficulty and war and famine and all this horrific thing that we experience now. This present evil age will end, and there will be a new age that will come. This is the kind of the idea of eternal life, or the next step, the next stage. And an eschatological prophet is one who is looking towards the end of this age and on to the next. Also in this text, Jesus will be seen as a miracle worker, but ultimately, he's going to be seen as a Messiah who is keeping his identity secret, one who is deeply suffering, but one who's going to come soon. Now, if you can tie it back to what we just learned a few minutes ago, Jesus's sense of a suffering Messiah makes a lot of sense, because the early Christians here in Rome who are receiving this Gospel of Mark would be really encouraged by the fact that their Messiah has also suffered as they are suffering. Now, interestingly enough, in the Gospel of Mark, we have over and over and over how Jesus's identity is revealed, and then Jesus tells people, whatever you do, don't tell anyone. Well, let's look here. Let's look at the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 8, looking down in verse 27. This is Mark 8:27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around the region known as Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, Jesus asked his disciples this question: who do people say that I am? The disciples replied, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others say you are one of the prophets. Jesus asked them, but what about you? Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them to tell nobody about him. So the question is, why on earth would Jesus tell them to keep this a secret? Because I thought, right, that we were supposed to go out and tell everybody about Jesus and who Jesus is. Well, we find out in the Gospel of Mark, there's what's called the messianic secret. Jesus is keeping his identity hidden until a particular time. And the question is, why would he keep this secret? Well, let's go on and look at the next verse that we were reading, verse 31 of Mark 8. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. He must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this and took Peter aside and began to rebuke him. What happens is, when the early Christians or the early Jewish Christians would hear the idea of Messiah, they would think about 150 years before Jesus's life, Judas the Maccabees, they would think a military leader who was going to be deeply religious, who was going to come and throw off the Romans and win this great military victory. But Jesus is trying to help them understand that Messiah is connected to suffering. Jesus says, the Son of Man will be betrayed and turned over to the hands of others and suffer and die. This idea of Jesus's identity of Messiah being tied to his suffering. The reason why he wants to keep his identity secret until he's crucified is so that people will not miss the notion that with Messiah comes suffering and death. So we see some places where Jesus clearly talks about his suffering. An important verse in the Gospel of Mark comes from Mark chapter 10, verse 45. So when Jesus talks about himself, he often refers to himself as the Son of Man, or kind of the ideal human. And he says, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many, meaning that he didn't come to be dominant or powerful and have other people serve him, but he came to serve the world and to serve other people and to give his life. The idea of a ransom means it's an idea of a payment, or a payment given to release someone held in slavery. So Jesus believed that he has come to give his life to free people from slavery, which we know the slavery of sin and death. So as the Gospel of Mark starts out, I just want to highlight a couple of different places when we think about the Gospel of Mark. And the first place I want to highlight is the beginning of the story when Jesus calls his disciples. In Mark chapter 1, we find out Jesus, as he's calling his disciples, unconventionally, he doesn't go to the Jewish synagogue or the Jewish church, or he doesn't go to the temple to call disciples. He goes out to the seashore where the fishermen are, and he begins to call his disciples. Let's pick this up in Mark chapter 1, verse 16. As Jesus walked along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Jesus said, "Come, follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and they followed him. When he'd gone a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men who had followed him. Now, this is radical because Jesus is calling people from unexpected places. Fishermen would have been rough, foul-talking people, not the most educated of people. They would have been tough, hardworking, determined, but not kind of a classy kind of people. And when Jesus calls them, he uses language that makes sense to them, right? I'll make you fishers of people. And the powerful thing is the disciples respond right away, instantly, leaving their nets, their boats, their father in the boats, and they have this brand new radical focus of their lives. Jesus meets them in their environment and calls them, and the call is so powerful, they're willing to leave everything they have to follow him. This becomes emblematic, or an image of what it means to follow Jesus throughout the New Testament, is that when he calls, you go, you leave what you're doing, and no looking back, right? You go because Jesus has asked you to do something even greater than what you've been doing before. Now, as the story goes on, the Gospel of Mark tells us a second story. Well, there is a man who is sick. He's at least paralyzed, and he can't move. His friends can't get him to Jesus because the crowd is so large in the house. So what they do is they lower this man down through the roof, kind of in the center of the crowd. And Jesus turns to this paralyzed man and he says, "Your sins are forgiven." And the religious leaders who are looking on in this story are very upset. This comes from Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. The religious leaders become very upset because they think, how in the world does Jesus have any authority to forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins. Jesus says, hey, what's easier for me to say? This guy's sins are forgiven, or for him to get up and walk? Well, he turns to the man, he says, get up, take up your mat and walk. In this instant, the crowd is stunned because this man who was paralyzed gets up, picks up his mat, and he walks through the crowd. And Jesus does this to prove that he has the power to forgive sins. Now, the healing story of the paralyzed man, we can get so caught up in the fact of, oh man, a guy was paralyzed, but now he can walk. But that's really not the heart and soul of the story. The heart and soul of the story is the idea that Jesus took on the authority to forgive the sins of this man. Now, why would that matter? In the ancient world, people believed that only God could forgive sins. So when Jesus is claiming the power and the authority to forgive sins, Jesus is making a claim about himself. Jesus is saying, I am God. I forgive sins. This is going to cause a huge ripple in the onlookers in the crowd. And some people are going to be very scandalized by the fact of the claims that Jesus is making. Yet, at the end of the story, one of the things that people say as the crowd is talking amongst themselves, they say, we've never seen anything like this. So as you read through the Gospel of Mark, you are left with this question of, who is this guy? You know, what's he like? What's he claiming about himself? And we realize as we get to chapter 8, we find out he's the Messiah, but yet we still don't exactly know what this Messiah means. And it's not until the end of the text that we see that Jesus suffers on the cross, dies, is buried. 3 days later, he rises again. We realize that he is the suffering Messiah who is God in the flesh. We're stunned by this revelation of who Jesus is. Now, as we go along, we find out that in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has a dramatic encounter. Jesus has been going out. An interesting thing about the Gospel of Mark is we find out the writer of the story transitions different between story from story by moving Jesus to a different location. So let's, if you have your Bible, look at Mark chapter 5 and 5 verse 1, and you can pick up what I'm talking about. Mark 5 verse 1, they went across the lake to the region of the Gennesarenes, or the Gerasenes, right? And in this, that first verse has Jesus physically moving from one spot to the next. And that's the way the author is transitioning from one story to the next. So as Jesus transitions to this new region, the Gerasenes, Jesus gets out of the boat. This is Mark 5, verse 2. Jesus gets out of the boat, and a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart, broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When Jesus saw this man from a distance, he ran, fell on his knees in front of Jesus, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" The man said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. Well, in this story, we find out that Jesus takes authority over these unclean or evil spirits, casts them into a herd of pigs. The pigs then run down the hill and drowned into the water. Later, the community gathers and asks Jesus to leave. At the end of the story, we find out verse 15, Mark 5:15. When the crowd came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed. by the legion of demons. Sitting there, he was dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and about what happened to the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting in the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with Jesus. Jesus did not let him, but Jesus said, "Go home to your own people. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." This dramatic encounter goes from a man who's in the tombs, chained up, acting like a wild animal, completely nude, supernatural power, yelling and screaming and completely controlled by these demons, to now he is in his right mind, he's clothed, and he's in talking with Jesus and seeking to go with Jesus. What does this story tell us? Well, a couple of things. It gives us a window into the power between good and evil, between the Spirit of God and these unclean or demonic spirits. And we see some hallmarks of demonic spirits, right? Hanging around the dead, animal-like qualities, self-harm, completely destroying of oneself. Now, I don't mean if you struggle with depression or you've self-harmed before. I'm not saying that, but anything that's trying to kill us is really of the enemy and of these wicked forces, right? And when Jesus encounters this man, the man says, "Whatever you do, don't torment me," because his experience has been with destruction and torment when these spirits come along. But however, Jesus is a different type of powerful spiritual entity, right? Jesus wants to free him and release him. Now, in the story, the man is filled with many demons. And when he's asked his name, he says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He actually uses a Roman military term. Legion means hundreds of troops. And this is powerful because Jesus is taking authority over these unclean spirits. But also the author is trying to indicate to us that Jesus also has the power over any Roman authority, Roman military authority. And at the end of the story, Jesus tells this man to go home and tell the people what God has done for him, the way that he has received mercy. And we contrast that with his fear. Originally, the man's fear of receiving torment, and what he received was mercy. This story is trying to pit those two concepts and show that Jesus is the one who ushers in mercy. Now, one other story I want to highlight for us in the Gospel of Mark is in Mark, the end of Mark 5. We were just there in the first part of Mark 5. Well, as Jesus goes along, he changes scenes again, and this is Mark 5, verse 21. When Jesus again had crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. And Jesus is encountered by a group of people that let him know that the leader of the synagogue, right, the Jewish place of worship, the leader of the synagogue, his daughter is very, very ill, like very seriously ill, and Jesus should come and to heal her, right? So Jesus begins to go with the crowd. Now, in that moment, as Jesus is going through the crowd and going to go to this man's house to try to heal his daughter, Jesus is encountered by a woman who has been sick for 12 years. The woman has been having an issue of blood. We don't know, but it has something to do with her menstruation cycle. It just says that she has an issue of blood, and she has grown more sick over the time. She's spent all of her money on doctors, and her perpetual bleeding makes her impure. It makes her unclean. Now, remember what we've talked about, right? If a person who's unclean touches a person who's clean, the uncleanness will come on that person, right? So Jesus is the visiting teacher in the community. This woman comes and she believes if she can just grab a hold of Jesus, something could possibly happen to her. Maybe that she could possibly be made better. So she reaches out and she touches Jesus. And in that moment, when she touches the the part of his prayer shawl that he would wear with around his neck, when she touches that, she knows that something's happened to her body. And Jesus feels that power has come out of him, but he looks around at the crowd and he doesn't know who's touched her. He asks his disciples, "Who touched me?" And they say, "Look at this crowd, Jesus. Who in the world? How would we know?" Finally, the woman comes up and she puts herself at Jesus's knees and she says, "I am the woman who touched you." And Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Now, this woman has been sick for 12 years. Jesus was on his way to heal a man's daughter who was sick. This daughter was 12 years old. Things seem to resolve itself, except what happens? We forgot about the synagogue ruler's daughter who was so ill. Story continues. Jesus finally gets to the home of the synagogue ruler, and he finds out the synagogue ruler's daughter is no longer sick. She's dead. Jesus removes everyone from the house except for the child's father and mother and his few disciples with him. This is Mark 5, verse 41. Jesus took her, meaning this 12-year-old girl, by the hand, and he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. They gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is a dramatic resurrection. This young woman was dead, and now she's alive. And the synagogue ruler, his daughter, he's overwhelmed and amazed. And here she was, 12 years old. There's a couple details that are so interesting in the story. One, that she was a daughter. Two, that she was 12 years old. Go back a second. Remember that woman who interrupts the story? The woman who clutches onto Jesus's prayer cloth, who's been sick. How long has she been sick? 12 years. She was seen as unclean. She was seen as cursed in the community. When Jesus heals her and she comes and puts herself in front of Jesus, he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." You see, Jesus was going to heal a woman, or he was going to heal the synagogue ruler's daughter. But in the midst, he encounters another woman and he gives her the beloved title of daughter. The community saw her as cursed. The community saw her as impure. But Jesus redefines her identity and says, "Daughter." This is a powerful story inside of a story, to see Jesus as a miracle worker. Finally, the last story I want to highlight is a story that you're going to read in the Gospel of Mark. And it's Jesus's, and this is in Mark chapter 7. In Mark 7, we find out that Jesus is encountered by the Bible tells us in verse 24 of Mark 7, you see there on your screen, Mark 7:24. Jesus left that place. Again, remember, see how he's leaving a place, transitioning of the story. He leaves that place and he goes on to the village of Tyre. He enters a home where he did not want anyone to know that he was there, but he could not keep his presence secret. Verse 25, in fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at Jesus' feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian and Syrophoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive a demon out of her daughter. Now, the idea that she is a Syrophoenician woman is totally lost on us. Like, I don't even know what that word means. I don't know what they're talking about. Well, pause right there. Anytime there's a word we don't know, we should pause and kind of figure out what it means. This is telling us she's from a group of people in a region of Israel where, if you go way back in the story of the Bible, if you go back to the time of Moses, this great Jewish religious leader, when Moses dies, God's people were on the verge of going into what's known as the Promised Land, or modern day Israel. Except in this land, there were other people that were there. They were called the Canaanites. And God asked the next leader, the one who replaced Moses, because Moses had died, Joshua, to go in and to wipe these people out. These people were Canaanites or Syrophoenicians. Fast forward 1,500 years later, we get to the time of Jesus, who is Jewish. He comes in the line of Moses. He comes in the line of Joshua. He's encountered by a Syrophoenician woman. These people have been enemies for 1,500 years. What's Jesus going to do? Here is an enemy of the people of Israel. Her little daughter is sick. Jesus turns to her and he says, let the little children eat all that they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. The woman replied, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So in this story, rather than saying, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry your kid's sick, Jesus turns to her and says, it's important for the children to eat first, and then the scraps can go to the dogs. It appears like Jesus is calling this woman and her daughter dogs. What do you do with that? It looks like Jesus is either a racist, a sexist, or just a complete jerk. Here's how the woman responds, verse 28. Lord, she replies, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Jesus told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home and she found her child lying on the bed and the demon was gone. What's happening in this story? Is Jesus a jerk? Is Jesus testing her? Is Jesus being sarcastic? Is it possible that Jesus is simply repeating a line that other Jewish men of his time would have said? Or is Jesus saying something which is on the surface completely wrong because he knows that this woman is going to model the correct answer? Does Jesus set the stage to allow this woman to give a profound answer? Maybe because Jesus is trying to teach the disciples around him something very different about how this idea of this woman, really, she's not an enemy, even though she's from a people who were deemed the opposites or the enemies, that maybe in Jesus's worldview, there are no enemies, there are no opposites, there are no others, because everybody at Jesus's table gets something to eat. Every person gets something to eat. This is a profound story that leaves Bible scholars really wondering what's going on. And in classic Mark fashion, the Gospel of Mark, we're left with the question of, who is this man? Well, at the end of our story, we find out that Jesus, he is going back and forth with the traditional leaders, the religious leaders of his time. He is continuing to challenge their authority and challenge the way that they are creating a system of religion that seems to be really oppressing people. Jesus is challenging them to think differently about the way they practice their religion. Not that their religion is bad, but he's asking them to exercise new insight in their religion to make sure that people who are in need are being helped. At the end of the story, we find out that Jesus is crucified, buried, and on the third day he rose again. And many of you read this story at the end of the Gospel of Mark of Jesus's resurrection. I just want to tie one thing in. The ending of Mark is the most controversial ending of all of the resurrection stories, because in the oldest copies of the New Testament we have, the end of the story of Mark ends in verse 9. So Jesus is raised from the dead, and in verse 9 it would say Jesus goes on, or the women who discover that Jesus has been raised, they go back to their home, lock the doors, are afraid, and don't tell anybody. That's the end of the story. the earliest manuscripts we have, that's the end. Now, later manuscripts we have discovered have verses 9 through 20, and it's a more traditional ending of the story that you are familiar with. Jesus meets with his disciples, he commissions them, he gives them power, he tells them to go out and to tell this good news to all of creation. But my question is this: how does the story change if this ending of verse 8, where the women just go and lock themselves in and are afraid, what would that be like for that to be the gospel that you read first, to be the one that you would hold in your hands? Because we know the Gospel of Mark was probably the first one circulated. Jesus is raised, but we're afraid. We don't know what to do with the truth. Again, leaving us with this question of who is this man and what do we do with him? Mark leaves us with a lot of questions. So this is the Gospel of Mark in a very, very brief and quick nutshell.